Before we begin, we just wanted to give a quick thank you to Jessica. Thank you so much for the kind donation over on Buy Me a Coffee, and thank you for the time you've given this channel, which is honestly worth even more. You've been around here a long while now, hanging out in the comments, listening in the small hours the same way a lot of you are right now, and every so often you'll send over a video idea, and some of those have turned into episodes that thousands of people have fallen asleep to since. That kind of thing doesn't show up on any graph, but it's really the whole reason this channel exists, and we truly appreciate you. And that brings me to something I want to mention to all of you listening tonight. Wherever you are, whatever hour it happens to be where you're lying right now, if you ever decide to leave a donation over on Buy Me a Coffee, please leave a video idea along with it. Tell us what keeps you awake. Tell us the story you have always wanted to hear told properly, slowly, in the dark, with the lights off and the world quiet. Because when you do that, the episode becomes yours. Your name goes at the front of it. Your idea becomes the thing that thousands of other people fall asleep to. We have built this entire library that way, one suggestion at a time, and it is honestly one of the best parts of doing this. It is truly appreciated, and we are so glad you're enjoying the content. Speaking of ideas that became episodes, tonight's story comes to us from Nathaniel. Nathaniel, thank you. This one has been sitting in the queue for a while, not because it was forgotten, but because it needed room. It needed the long treatment. It needed to be told the way it deserves to be told, with all of the strange edges left in and none of the difficult parts smoothed over. So tonight, that is exactly what we are going to do. All right, get comfortable. Let the room go dark. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears and let your jaw unclench, because you have probably been holding it without noticing. Tonight, we are going to Florida. Not the Florida of postcards and beaches and neon. We're going to the inland Florida of pine scrub and swamp gas and heat that does not break after sundown. We're going to a place that covers 464,000 acres of land and controls more than 120,000 square miles of airspace and water range beyond that. A place so large that entire towns could disappear inside it, and nobody would ever notice the gap. We are going to Eglin Air Force Base, and we are going to talk about 6 men who walked out of it in July of 1990 and did not come back. This is the story of the Gulf 6. This is the mission that never ended. Now, before we go any further, I need to be honest with you about what this story is, because that honesty is the whole foundation of this channel, and I am not going to abandon it now. There was a real disappearance. That part is documented, verifiable, and genuinely strange. In July of 1990, 6 United States Army soldiers assigned to the 7th Special Forces Group vanished from Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. They were real men with real names and real families. The event was real. The nationwide search was real. The headlines were real. What happened next, in the official record, is that those 6 men eventually surrendered and were prosecuted for being absent without leave. There is no evidence, none whatsoever, that anything described in the second half of tonight's story actually occurred. What we are building tonight is a work of speculative fiction. It grows out of a real event the way a vine grows out of a crack in concrete, and the crack is real, but the vine is something we are planting ourselves. I tell you this now so that you can let go of the work of sorting fact from invention. You do not have to keep score tonight. Just listen. Let the story carry you down. Ready? Then let us begin where every version of this story begins, at a gate, in the heat, in the summer of 1990. Part 1. The base that ate the map. To understand what happened at Eglin, you first have to understand Eglin itself, and I do not think most people ever really have. When you hear the words Air Force Base, you probably picture something with a fence around it, a runway, a cluster of hangars, some barracks, a commissary, a water tower with a name painted on the side. Something you could drive around the perimeter of in 20 minutes, something with a definite shape. Eglin is not that. Eglin Air Force Base is the largest Air Force base in the world by land area. It occupies a stretch of the Florida Panhandle so vast that when you look at it on a map, the reservation appears less like a military installation and more like a geological feature, a blank space, a place where the roads simply stop and the names of towns give way to nothing at all. 464,000 acres. That is roughly 725 square miles of pine forest, sand ridge, cypress swamp and coastal marsh. You could set the entire city of Los Angeles down inside it and still have room left over for the woods to swallow the edges, and it does not stop there. Beyond the land itself, Eglin controls an enormous stretch of restricted airspace and open Gulf water, more than 120,000 square miles of it. There are places on that range where a person could stand and turn a complete circle and see nothing in any direction that indicates the 20th century ever happened. Just pine, just sand, just the low hum of insects and the pressure of the heat. The base was built in the 1930s, and it grew during the Second World War the way everything military grew during the Second World War, which is to say enormously and quickly, and without much regard for what it displaced. Whole communities were bought out, roads were closed, small towns that had existed since the 1800s simply became range numbers. By the summer of 1990, Eglin had been swallowing things for over 50 years. The Second World War pilots trained there for the Doolittle raid, practicing short takeoffs on marked strips in the Florida sand before they ever saw the deck of a carrier. In the decades that followed, the range hosted weapons testing of nearly every conceivable kind. Airdropped ordnance, guided munitions, countermeasure systems, test articles that had names in the records and no descriptions attached to them. There are, on the Eglin Reservation, hundreds of numbered test sites. Some of them are elaborate installations with permanent staff and climate-controlled buildings. Others are little more than a concrete pad in a clearing with a fence around it, and a sign that gives a number and a warning and nothing else. Some of them are still in use. Some of them were abandoned decades ago, and are being slowly reclaimed by the pines, their access roads dissolving back into sand, their gates rusting shut. That is the important part. Hold on to that. Eglin is not one place. Eglin is hundreds of places, and many of them are alone in the woods, and many of them have been alone in the woods for a very long time. It is a base with pockets, and what our story asks, in the gentlest possible way, is a simple question. What if something was in one of those pockets? Part 2. The summer of 1990. Now let us set the season, because the season matters. The summer of 1990 was a strange hinge in history, and people living through it could feel the hinge turning, even if they could not name it. The Berlin Wall had come down 8 months earlier. The Cold War, the great organising structure of American military life for 45 years, was visibly ending. Entire careers had been built around an adversary that was, week by week, ceasing to exist. There were officers at that moment in their 40s who had joined the service to face down the Soviet Union and were now watching that union crack apart on the evening news. And into that vacuum, something else was already moving. On August 2nd of 1990, Iraqi forces would cross into Kuwait, and the entire American military apparatus would pivot toward the Persian Gulf. But in July, that had not happened yet. In July of 1990, the American military was in an odd, humming in-between state. Deployments were being planned for reasons that were not entirely clear. Units were being moved. Budgets that had been aimed at one enemy for 4 decades were suddenly unassigned. If you were going to hide a program, if you were going to bury a line item in an appropriations document, the summer of 1990 would have been an extraordinarily good time to do it. The accountants were all looking somewhere else. That is the historical backdrop. And this is the tone I want you to carry into the rest of tonight's story, because it is the tone that makes the whole thing work. Nothing about a conspiracy has to be dramatic. It does not require villains twirling anything. It requires only a bureaucracy that is distracted, a budget that is in flux, and a piece of land large enough that nobody notices one more fence. Bureaucratic realism. That is what makes a story like this crawl under the skin. Not monsters, paperwork. Part 3, 6 men. The 7th Special Forces Group is not an ordinary unit. Special Forces soldiers, the ones people call Green Berets, are selected through one of the most demanding assessment processes in the American military. The washout rate is severe. The training is long, measured in years rather than weeks. Beyond the physical requirements, which are considerable, candidates are screened heavily for psychological stability, for language aptitude, for the capacity to operate for extended periods with minimal supervision, in environments where the rules are ambiguous and the support is distant. That last quality is the one that matters most for our story. Special Forces soldiers are not trained to be obedient in the simple sense. They are trained to be independent. They are trained to be dropped into a situation, assess it, and make decisions without a chain of command standing behind them. They are trained to notice things, and critically, they are trained to keep their mouths shut. Discretion is not a nice to have in that world. It is the job. These are men whose entire professional existence is built around holding information and not spilling it. In July of 1990, 6 such men were assigned to Eglin Air Force Base. They were, by every account that survives, competent soldiers, not troublemakers, not disciplinary cases, men with clearances, with records, with careers in motion, men who had already given the army years of their lives and had every reason to give it more. And on July 17th of 1990 they left, not with a formal complaint, not with a request for transfer, not through any of the dozen bureaucratic channels available to a soldier with a grievance. They simply went. That is the fact that has kept this case alive for more than 30 years, and it is the fact that no official explanation has ever managed to fully absorb. Because desertion, in the ordinary sense, tends to be a solitary act. A soldier gets overwhelmed, gets homesick, gets into debt or trouble, and slips away. It happens. It has always happened. Militaries have accounted for it since militaries existed. 6 men leaving together at the same time with coordination is not that. 6 is a team. 6 is a decision. Part 4. The official story. Let me give you the official version now, plainly and fairly because it deserves to be heard on its own terms before we start pulling at threads. According to the accepted account, the 6 soldiers left Eglin under the influence of an apocalyptic religious conviction. They had, in this telling, come to believe that some significant end times event was imminent, and they departed in order to travel to a place where they believed they were meant to be present when it happened. Their journey took them across the country. They were eventually located in the western United States, and they surrendered without any violence whatsoever. They were returned to military custody. They were charged with being absent without leave. The army processed them, and the matter concluded. That is the official record, and I want to be clear that it is not implausible. People do experience religious crises. Groups of people do sometimes experience them together, reinforcing one another's convictions until a shared belief hardens into a shared plan. This is a well-documented human phenomenon, and it does not require any conspiracy to explain. But there are aspects of the case that have kept people talking for 3 decades, and those aspects are what our story tonight is built out of. The first is the coordination. This was not a spontaneous walk-off. It had structure. The second is the training. These were men specifically selected for psychological resilience and screened repeatedly for stability. Whatever moved them past filters that are designed to catch exactly this. The third is the silence afterward. The men served their consequences and by and large did not spend the following decades publicly relitigating what happened. There was no book tour, no documentary, circuit, no lawsuit. Silence can mean many things. Silence can mean embarrassment. Silence can mean a chapter of life a person simply wants closed. Or, if you're the sort of person who is inclined to build a story out of a gap, silence can mean something else entirely. Tonight, we're going to be that sort of person. Because from here, the documented record ends, and the story begins. and I want to be absolutely clear one final time because I take this seriously. Everything that follows is invention. It is a story. It is a thing we are making together in the dark, and none of it is claimed as fact. But it starts, as the best of these stories always do, with a real man on a real night, standing at the edge of a real forest, looking at something he was not supposed to see. Part 5. Strange Orders. It started, as these things always do, with something too small to report. In the last week of June, the 6 men began receiving assignments that did not fit the shape of anything they had done before. Understand how a special forces team normally receives work. There is a mission, there is a purpose, there is a chain of accountability. Even in classified environments, a soldier generally knows what category of thing he is doing, if not the specifics. He knows whether he is training, whether he is providing security, whether he is rehearsing an insertion. The shape of the task is visible even when the details are not. These assignments had no shape. They were told to report to a specific coordinate on the East Range at 2200 hours. They were told to bring standard kit. They were told nothing about what they would find there or what they would be expected to do. When one of them asked through the appropriate channel what the mission profile was, he received a response that was polite, prompt, and entirely empty. He was told that the profile would be communicated on site. It never was. What they found at that coordinate was a bus, not a military transport, not a truck, a civilian bus of the kind that carries workers to construction sites. Painted a flat grey with no markings, its windows covered from the inside with something opaque. The driver did not speak to them. There was no manifest. They were told to board. The bus drove for 50 minutes. The men could not see out. They could feel, though, the character of the road changing beneath them. Pavement, then a rougher pavement, then something that was not pavement at all, a graded sand track that made the whole vehicle sway and shudder like a boat in a swell. They passed through what they believed were 3 checkpoints, based on the number of times the bus stopped, idled, and then moved forward again. When they got off, they were in a clearing in the pines, and there was nothing there but a portable light stand, a generator, and a group of 11 people in civilian clothing standing around a folding table covered in equipment. That was the first assignment. Their job, it turned out, was to stand at the perimeter of that clearing and watch the tree line while the civilians did whatever they were doing at the table. That was all. For 4 hours, 6 of the most highly trained soldiers in the United States Army stood in the Florida dark and watched pine trees, while nearby a group of people in polo shirts and khakis adjusted instruments and spoke quietly to one another in a technical vocabulary none of the soldiers recognised. At 0200 the civilians packed up. The bus came back. Everyone went home. That was assignment 1. There were 11 more over the next 2.5 weeks. Part 6. The Things You Notice. Here is the thing about training men to be observant and then giving them nothing to do but observe. They observe. The team leader, a man we'll call Sergeant First Class Michael Rourke, started keeping a notebook. Not an official log, which would have been a violation. A personal one. Small, cheap. The kind you buy at a gas station, kept in his left cargo pocket. He wrote in it after each assignment, back in his quarters, from memory. What he wrote down, over those 2.5 weeks, was a list of things that did not make sense. The civilians were never the same group twice. Individual faces repeated, but the composition changed each time, as though people were being rotated in and out of a much larger pool. Rourke counted at least 31 distinct individuals over 12 assignments. None of them wore identification. Not badges, not lanyards, not the visible credentials that are practically a uniform on any working military installation. On a base like Eglin, a person without a badge is stopped within minutes. These people had no badges at all, and nobody ever stopped them. The equipment was wrong. Rourke had been around enough hardware to recognise its general lineage, even when he did not know the specific system. Military equipment has a look. It is built to a standard, it is finished a particular way, it carries stock numbers and manufacturer plates in predictable locations. What he saw on those folding tables did not look like that. It looked like laboratory equipment. It looked, in his words, like something out of a university. Every operation was at night. Not most, every single one. And then there were the malfunctions. The first time it happened, Rourke assumed a battery had gone bad. His radio, a hardened field unit that had never given him trouble, produced a rising tone in his earpiece and then went entirely dead for approximately 4 minutes before resuming normal function on its own. The second time, it happened to 3 radios at once, simultaneously, and when they came back, all 3 came back at the same instant. Simultaneous failure across independent units, followed by simultaneous recovery, is not a battery problem. That is an environmental effect. That is something in the air. The compasses were worse. On the 6th assignment, one of the soldiers, checking his bearing out of pure habit during a long shift, noticed his compass needle drifting. Not swinging wildly, drifting. Rotating slowly and steadily, perhaps 2 degrees every 10 seconds, as though the entire magnetic north of the planet were being gently and continuously relocated somewhere off to his left. He watched it for 6 minutes. It rotated through more than 180 degrees during that time. Then it stopped, hung motionless for perhaps 20 seconds, and swung back to true north with a snap he could feel through the housing. He showed the others. Nobody said anything for a while. Then one of them, the youngest, said what everybody was thinking. There is nothing in the field manual for that. Part 7. The paperwork. On the 8th assignment, before boarding the bus, they were handed additional documents to sign. This is worth pausing on, because to understand why it alarmed them, you need to understand what these men were used to. Every soldier at their level had already signed a great deal of paperwork. Non-disclosure agreements are routine in that world. Special access program briefings come with their own read-on documents. A man with a high clearance has signed his name to secrecy dozens of times and thinks nothing of it. Signing a form is not by itself frightening. This form was different in 3 ways. The first was that it referenced no program. Every read-on document any of them had ever signed identified, at minimum, the compartment they were being admitted to, even if only by a code word. This document identified nothing. It described obligations attached to information encountered during the performance of duties at a location, and the location was given only as a set of coordinates. The second was the duration. The obligations described in the document were explicitly permanent, not for the duration of service, not for a specified term of years, permanent, with language extending the obligation past separation from the military and past the termination of the program itself. The third was the acknowledgement clause, and this was the one that made Rourke's hands go cold. The document included a section in which the signer acknowledged that he had been informed of the potential physiological effects of proximity to the test environment, and waived certain claims relating thereto. Rourke read that line 4 times. Nobody had informed him of any physiological effects. Nobody had informed him of anything at all. The document was asking him to sign a statement confirming that a conversation had taken place which had never taken place. He asked the man with the clipboard about it. The man with the clipboard said, and Rourke wrote this down that night in the gas station notebook, that the briefing referenced had been delivered at the unit level, and that if Rourke had questions about the content of that briefing, he should direct them to his chain of command. Rourke's chain of command, when he raised it 2 days later, had never heard of any of it. He signed the document. All 6 of them did. You might wonder why, and the answer is the most human thing in this entire story. Because refusing would have been a much bigger deal than signing. Because he was 34 years old with 11 years in, a wife, 2 kids, and a career. Because the alternative to signing was a conversation with an officer that began with the words, "I am refusing a lawful order," and every man reading that clipboard knew exactly where that conversation ended. That is how these things work, not through force, through the enormous, quiet, everyday pressure of not wanting to be the person who makes a problem. They signed. and 4 nights later the bus took a different road. Part 8, Site 13. The turn came at minute 31. Rourke knew the route by then, in the way a blindfolded man knows a route, by the rhythm of it. 12 minutes of smooth pavement, 9 minutes of rougher road, then the graded sand track and its particular sideways sway. On the night of July 12th, at minute 31, the bus turned left where it had always turned right. Nobody said anything, but all 6 of them registered it, and the small movement of 6 heads coming up at the same moment was itself a kind of communication. The drive continued for another 35 minutes, longer than any previous run. The road got worse and then, abruptly, got better, transitioning to a smooth surface that felt like fresh asphalt. That detail bothered Rourke more than anything else that night. Fresh asphalt, an hour deep into a range that officially contained nothing. Then the bus stopped, and the door opened, and they stepped out into the humid dark, and they saw the hangar. It should not have been there. It was an aircraft hangar of an older design, the arched roof and enormous sliding doors of a structure built sometime in the 1940s or 50s. It sat in a clearing perhaps 400 yards across, and the clearing itself was the wrong shape, too regular, its edges cut too clean against the pines. The building was, at first glance, derelict. The exterior paint had gone to chalk. Vegetation had crept up the walls on the eastern side. 2 of the high windows were broken, and yet the apron in front of the doors was clear. Not clear as in swept, clear as in maintained, with no vegetation pushing through the seams in the concrete, and there is no such thing as untended concrete in Florida. Florida takes concrete back within 2 seasons. Something had been keeping that apron clean, continuously, for a long time. The parking area to the south held 9 vehicles, all civilian, all recent models, and running along the ground from a low structure at the tree line to the base of the hangar's western wall was a bundle of armoured electrical conduit thick enough that Rourke could not have gotten both hands around it. That was the detail that ended the argument in his head. You do not run that much power to an abandoned building. Above the personnel door, stencilled directly onto the metal in white paint that was newer than the paint around it, were 2 words and a number. Site 13. Part 9. Inside. They were not at first taken inside. They were posted around the exterior, 2 men at the vehicle approach, 2 at the northern tree line, 2 at the southern corner of the structure. They were told the same thing they were always told, which was to watch the tree line and report anything unusual, and by that point the phrase had acquired a certain flavour. Rourke drew the southern corner. From that position he could see the personnel door, the parking area, and, through one of the broken high windows, a narrow slice of the interior. The interior was lit, not with work lights. With permanent overhead lighting, the cold, even institutional light of a functioning facility, and through that narrow slice of window Rourke could see, over the course of the night, an enormous amount of activity. He saw the top of a structure, circular. He could see perhaps a third of its arc, and he estimated from that arc a total diameter somewhere between 60 and 80 feet. It was ringed with something that caught the light in a way that suggested polished metal, and it was surrounded by scaffolding on which people were working. He saw the cooling equipment. That was the part that told him the most, because cooling equipment is not exotic, it is plumbing. Rourke had seen industrial refrigeration before, and what was running along the visible portion of the interior wall was industrial refrigeration on a scale he associated with food processing plants and ice rinks. Heavily insulated lines, condensation forming on the exterior of the insulation despite the wrapping. Compressors he could hear from outside the building, running continuously all night. You do not cool a building that way. You cool a building with air conditioning. What he was looking at was equipment designed to take something down to a temperature far below anything a human being would tolerate. He saw people moving, dozens of them. far more than the 9 cars in the lot could account for, which meant there was another way in, or people were staying there, or both. And around 0100 he heard the sound. It began below the range of hearing. He felt it in his sternum before his ears registered anything, a pressure that arrived from no particular direction. Then it climbed into the audible range as a low tone, deep and pure, entirely unlike the sound of any machine he'd heard before. No mechanical roughness, no reciprocating rhythm, just a rising, clean, terrible note. It climbed for perhaps 40 seconds. The lights inside the hangar dimmed noticeably at the peak, and then the tone cut out. Not faded. Cut instantly, the way a recording stops. In the silence afterward, Rourke found that he had a nosebleed. He checked with the others when the shift ended. 2 of the 6 had nosebleeds. 2 more reported a headache located, they both said, unprompted behind the eyes. 1 reported nothing at all, and one of them, the youngest, the one who had spoken up about the compass, said something quietly to Rourke as they walked to the bus. He said that when the tone was at its highest, he had tasted metal, and he had seen the horizon move, not shake, move. He described it as the tree line briefly appearing to be closer than it was, as though the distance between himself and the pines had been momentarily reduced and then restored. Rourke wrote all of it down that night, and then he wrote one more line at the bottom of the page, and it is the line that begins the second half of this story. He wrote, "What are we guarding?" Part 10. Project Gulf Star. The overhearing was an accident, and that is the only reason it happened. On the night of July 14th, a thunderstorm came across the range. Anyone who has spent a summer in the Florida Panhandle knows the kind. It builds all afternoon out over the Gulf, black and vertical, and then it arrives after dark with a violence that feels personal. The security posture on the hangar exterior became untenable within 10 minutes. Standing in an open clearing beside a metal building during a Florida lightning storm is not a security measure. It is a method of dying. So they were brought inside, not into the main bay, into a corridor along the eastern wall, a service passage lined with electrical panels and storage lockers, where they were told to wait and where the door at the far end was, whether by oversight or because nobody thought it mattered, not fully closed. Through that gap, for approximately 11 minutes, the 6 men heard a briefing. Rourke reconstructed it afterward in the notebook, and what follows is his reconstruction. He was clear, always, that it was partial. He heard fragments. He heard a man speaking with the flat cadence of someone presenting to a room of people who already understood the material. He filled the gaps himself. Here is what he wrote. The speaker referred to the program by name twice. The name was Project Gulf Star. The speaker discussed a schedule. There was a test designated Test 7 scheduled for a date Rourke could not make out, and there was significant discussion of whether the containment envelope would hold at what the speaker called full field. There was a conversation about power draw. A figure was mentioned that Rourke wrote down as a number of megawatts, and then he wrote beside it a note saying he did not believe he had heard it correctly. There was a discussion of what the speaker called the recovered geometry. Rourke underlined that phrase 3 times, and there was a moment near the end when a woman's voice interrupted with a question. She asked whether the mass estimate for the platform included the crew. There was a pause. The speaker said that Test 7 was uncrewed. The woman asked whether Test 6 had been, and the room went quiet, and someone closed the door. Part 11. What they were building. Let us step out of the corridor for a moment and talk about what this fictional program was actually meant to be, because a story like this only holds together if the technology inside it has a coherent logic. The premise of Project Gulf Star in our story is not a spacecraft. It is not a flying saucer in the popular sense. It is something both stranger and more mundane. The premise is that gravity is not a force in the ordinary sense, but a property of the shape of space itself, and that the shape of space, under sufficiently extreme conditions, can be altered. This is not, in its general outline, fringe thinking. The idea that gravity is the curvature of space-time rather than a force acting across distance is the central insight of general relativity, published in 1915, tested continuously ever since, and confirmed to extraordinary precision. Mass tells space how to curve. Curved space tells mass how to move. That is the whole architecture of gravity as modern physics understands it. What Project Gulfstar proposes in our fiction is a machine that produces curvature without mass. The consequences of such a machine, if it existed, would be difficult to overstate. A vehicle inside a region of engineered curvature would not need to be pushed. It would be falling continuously toward a gravitational well that it carried with it and that stayed always just ahead of it. It would experience no acceleration in the ordinary sense because it would not be accelerating relative to the space around it. The space would be doing the moving. There would be no exhaust because there would be no reaction mass. There would be no engine noise in the mechanical sense because there would be no reciprocating parts driving the motion. There would be no upper limit imposed by the strength of materials because the vehicle would not experience the forces that tear conventional vehicles apart. And there would be, as a consequence of the geometry, time effects. A clock inside a region of strong curvature runs slow relative to a clock outside it. This is not speculation. This is measured daily. Every satellite navigation system in the world must correct for it, or it would drift into uselessness within hours, which is why, in our story, the wristwatch matters. Part 12. The demonstration. They saw it on July 15th, 2 nights before they left. The assignment that night was different from the start. Instead of the exterior posts, they were brought into the main bay and stationed along the eastern wall, roughly 40 yards from the central structure, and told to remain in position and observe. For the first time, they saw the whole thing. The chamber was enormous. The hangar's interior had been gutted and rebuilt, the original floor removed and replaced with a poured concrete platform that Rourke estimated at 3 feet thick. The ceiling had been reinforced. The walls were lined, from floor to a height of perhaps 20 feet, with panels of a dull grey material that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. At the centre was the ring, 70 feet across, give or take. It sat perhaps 4 feet above the floor on a lattice of supports. It was, structurally, a torus, a donut, but the surface was not smooth. It was wound. Rourke described it as looking like the inside of an electric motor if the motor had been the size of a house. Countless turns of some heavy conductor, wrapped in a helical pattern, disappearing into an outer casing wrapped in the insulated cooling lines he'd seen from outside. Superconducting magnets. That was his guess at the time, and it was the right guess. That is what all the refrigeration was for. Certain materials, cooled sufficiently, lose all resistance to electrical current, and a current that meets no resistance can be run to intensities that would vaporize ordinary conductors. That is how you make a magnetic field of genuinely absurd strength, and it requires exactly the kind of industrial cryogenics Rourke had been listening to for 3 nights. In the centre of the ring, on a pedestal, sat a plate. That was all it was. A flat disc of dark metal, perhaps 4 feet in diameter, 6 inches thick, entirely featureless. It had no visible mechanism, no seams, no ports. It sat there like a manhole cover on a stand. There were 40 or 50 people in the bay. Most were on the observation platform along the northern wall behind what Rourke assumed was protective glass. At 23:42, by Rourke's watch, someone counted down over a public address system. And then the sound started. The same tone, the pressure in the chest before the ears register anything climbing. The lights dimmed, and the plate rose. It did not wobble, it did not tip, it did not spin or vibrate or show any of the small instabilities that any real hovering object shows. It rose off the pedestal in a movement so smooth and so utterly steady that Rourke said afterward it looked less like an object moving up and more like the floor moving down. It rose to a height of approximately 8 feet and stopped, and it hung there. No exhaust, no downwash, nothing moving beneath it, no disturbance of the dust on the floor, which Rourke specifically looked for and specifically noted because dust is the thing that gives away every fake. Dust always tells. There was no dust movement whatsoever, just a 4-foot disc of metal hanging 8 feet above a pedestal, in absolute silence except for that terrible pure tone. It stayed there for what Rourke estimated at 90 seconds. Then it descended just as smoothly and settled onto the pedestal with a small click that was, after all of that, almost comically ordinary. The tone wound down, the lights came back up, and on the observation platform people applauded. That was the detail that Rourke said stayed with him longest. Not the plate. The applause. The absolutely normal human sound of a room full of professionals who had gotten a good result and were pleased about it. Part 13. The Watch. They filed out through the eastern corridor. Halfway down it, the younger soldier stopped walking. He was looking at his wrist. His watch was a mechanical automatic, the kind that winds itself from the movement of the wearer's arm. He had inherited it. He wore it every day. The second hand was not moving. He held it to his ear. There was no sound. Now a mechanical watch can stop for any number of ordinary reasons. A shock. A worn part. Age. But 4 of the 6 men checked their watches in that corridor, and here is what they found. The younger soldier's automatic had stopped entirely. 2 men wearing quartz watches found that their watches were running, and correct. And Rourke, who wore a quartz watch, found that his was running and was slow, by 11 seconds. He knew it was 11 seconds because he had set it against the base time signal that morning, as he did every morning, a habit from a previous assignment where timing had mattered a great deal. 11 seconds in 15 hours would be an enormous drift for a quartz movement. Quartz watches do not lose 11 seconds in a day. They lose that much in a month. He stood in the corridor doing the arithmetic in his head, and he could not make it work. Unless it had not been a drift. Unless it had been a single loss, all at once, during 90 seconds when a disc of metal hung in the air 40 yards away. Part 14. The Physicist. The man found them outside. He was, Rourke guessed, in his early 60s. Thin, grey, wearing a windbreaker over a shirt that had been tucked in at the beginning of the day and had given up since. He had the specific exhaustion of a person who has not slept properly in a long time and has stopped expecting to. He came out the personnel door while the team was waiting for the bus, and he stood near them and lit a cigarette with hands that were not entirely steady. For a while, nobody said anything. Then he spoke, without looking at them, in the tone of a man talking to himself in the presence of others. He asked if they had been inside. Rourke said they had. The man nodded slowly. He smoked. And then he said the thing that Rourke wrote in the notebook that night and underlined twice. He said, "This isn't propulsion." Rourke asked what he meant. The man gestured back toward the hangar with the cigarette, a small tired motion. He said, "It's space bending around the machine." And then he explained, quickly and quietly, in the manner of a man who has been holding something for a long time, and has found 6 strangers who cannot possibly repeat it to anyone who matters. He told them that the plate did not go up. He said the plate stayed exactly where it was, and the definition of down changed in the volume immediately surrounding it. He told them that the ring was not a machine that made a field. He said the ring was a machine that shaped one. He said the field was already there, and had been there since before anyone in that building was born, and that the ring was an attempt to fold it. He told them that the reason for the cooling and the current and the noise was that the geometry they were trying to reproduce did not want to exist at the scale of a room, and every second of every test was an argument with the universe about whether it would be permitted to. Rourke asked him where the geometry had come from. The man stopped talking. He looked at Rourke for a long moment, and then he did something Rourke found more frightening than anything he had heard. He laughed. Once. Not bitterly. Just a small tired sound of a man being asked the one question he had promised himself he would never answer, by someone who had no idea what they were asking. He said, "You should be more worried about where it goes." And then the door opened behind him, and 2 men in civilian clothes came out, and one of them said the physicist's name, and the physicist put out his cigarette on the sole of his shoe with great care and went back inside. They never saw him again. On the following night's assignment, When Rourke asked one of the technicians a carefully casual question about the older gentleman who had been out front the previous evening, the technician said that he did not know who Rourke meant, and that there was nobody on the project matching that description. Rourke wrote that down too, and underneath it he wrote a single word. Now, Part 15, the maintenance logs. The thing that convinced them was not the plate. I want to be precise about this because it is the most human and most believable turn in the entire story. The plate was astonishing. But astonishment is not the same as fear, and a group of trained soldiers does not throw away 6 careers because they saw something impressive. They had all seen impressive things. That was the job. What convinced them was paperwork. On the night of July 16th, during the last assignment any of them would ever perform for the United States Army, 2 of the 6 were posted inside the building at the entrance to the Eastern Service Corridor. That corridor, as noted, was lined with storage lockers and electrical panels. It was also lined with binders, facility maintenance logs. The absolutely unremarkable documentation that any large industrial building generates continuously and forever. Records of filter changes, of compressor servicing, of who signed for what and when. Nobody classifies a maintenance log. Nobody thinks about it. It is the most invisible paper in any organisation. One of the soldiers, standing in a corridor for the 4th hour with nothing to do, took one off the shelf and read it. The logs went back to 1971. That was the first shock. The facility had been operating in some form for 19 years. The second shock was in the personnel entries. Maintenance logs are signed. Every entry carries a name and an employee number, because that is the entire point of a maintenance log, to establish who is accountable for what. The soldier began flipping backward through the binder, and he noticed something about the names. They stopped. Not gradually, the way a name stops appearing when someone changes jobs, tapering off across a few months. They stopped. A technician would sign entries at a steady rhythm for 2 years, 3 years, and then there would be a final entry, and then nothing, and the work would be picked up by someone else in a different hand on the following line. He found 11 such stops in one binder. He pulled a second binder. He found 9 more. And then he found something that took the entire thing out of the realm of coincidence. In the binder covering 1978, someone had made a correction. A page of entries had been struck through and re-entered, which happens, and beside the strike-through, a supervisor had written a note explaining the correction, which also happens. The note read that the entries were being reattributed as the original signing technician was no longer available for verification following the incident of the 9th. The incident of the 9th. He looked for the 9th. The log for the 9th of that month was gone, not torn out. The binder was continuous. The year 9th simply did not exist. The 8th was followed by the 10th, and the page numbering had been redone. He put the binder back. He went and got Rourke. Over the remaining hours of that shift, working in rotation so that the corridor was never unwatched, they went through as many binders as they could reach. Their final count, arrived at hurriedly and certainly incompletely, was between 30 and 40 personnel who appeared in those logs, worked for a period of months or years, and then stopped, permanently, on a specific date, with no transition entry of any kind. And in 3 of those cases, the stop coincided with a missing page. Now, here is why that mattered so much more than the floating plate. Because a floating plate is a marvel, and a marvel can be explained. But a missing page is decision. Somebody sat down at a desk and removed that page and renumbered the binder and initialed the correction. It was not a machine that did that. It was a person doing a job on an ordinary afternoon, probably before going home to dinner. That is what frightened them. Not the technology, the administration of the technology. The fact that somewhere in that building was an office where this sort of thing was handled routinely, and had been handled routinely for 19 years, and where there was presumably a procedure for it. 6 men had just been read onto a program with no name, signed permanent non-disclosure agreements referencing physiological effects nobody had described, watched a demonstration of technology that was not supposed to exist, spoken to a physicist who then ceased to exist, and discovered that this facility had a 19-year history of people simply not appearing in the paperwork anymore. And they had, all 6 of them, been on the wrong side of that count for 2.5 weeks. Part 16. The tape. The archive was not a vault. That is worth saying plainly, because people imagine security as a wall, and it is almost never a wall, it is a habit. The archive at Site 13, in our story, was a room off the northern corridor with a standard institutional door and a cipher lock. Inside were shelving units holding videotape, hundreds of cassettes, in the industrial half-inch format that was standard for engineering documentation in that era, each in a paper sleeve, each labelled by hand. The cipher lock had a 5-button mechanical code, the kind where the buttons must be pressed in sequence. Those locks are secure against a stranger and useless against anyone who has spent 20 hours in a corridor watching people go in and out of the door. Rourke had the code by the second night. He had not been trying to get it. He simply could not help acquiring it, in the way a man trained to observe cannot stop observing. On the final night, he used it. He was inside the room for 4 minutes and 40 seconds. He did not have time to be selective in any sophisticated way. He read labels. Most were dense with alphanumeric designations that meant nothing to him. Some were mundane, facility surveys and equipment calibration runs, and one, on the 3rd shelf, in a sleeve that was more worn than its neighbours, was labelled in a way he could immediately understand. Site 13, Test 7. He wrote later that he took it because it was the only one he could read. He put it inside his shirt, against his back, under his gear. He closed the door. He returned to his post. And in the 90 minutes remaining in that shift, standing in the dark at the southern corner of a building that officially did not exist, Sergeant First Class Michael Rourke made the decision that ends the first half of this story. He had, in theory, options. He could report it up the chain. But the chain of command had already told him, twice, that things which had unambiguously happened had not happened. The chain was not a channel. The chain was part of the structure. He could go to the Inspector General, but an IG complaint about a special access program goes, by procedure, to people cleared for that program. He could go to Congress, but a soldier does not simply walk into a congressional office, and the process of getting there involves, at every step, informing someone that he intends to go. He could go to the press, and that, in the end, was the only door that did not lead back into the building. But you cannot walk into a newsroom in uniform carrying a stolen videotape and expect to be believed. You need time. You need distance. You need to be somewhere that a phone call from a base commander cannot reach. And most of all, you need to be gone before anybody notices what is missing. The 6 men met at 0400 on the morning of July 17th, 1990. The conversation, by Rourke's account, took under 20 minutes. There was no vote. There was no speech. There was a team leader laying out a situation, and 5 men who had spent years learning to assess a situation quickly and act on it, and who had all independently arrived at the same assessment days earlier, and had simply been waiting for someone to say it out loud. The plan was simple to the point of crudeness, which is the mark of a plan made by people who know they have no time. Get off the base, get out of the state, split the group so that no single interception loses everything. Move west, because west is where the country is emptiest and the distances are longest. Make contact with a journalist from a distance on their terms, and hand over the tape only when there was no possibility of the exchange being reversed. And then, when the tape was safe, surrender. All of them. Voluntarily, publicly, in a way that could not be quietly managed. That last part was Rourke's insistence, and it is the detail in this whole story that I find the most affecting, because it means that from the very first hour they knew they were going to prison. They were not running to get away. They were running to deliver something. The prison was on the schedule. At approximately 0500 on July 17th, 1990, 6 soldiers of the 7th Special Forces Group left Eglin Air Force Base and did not return. Part 17. The Manhunt. The reaction was immediate and enormous. and its scale is one of the genuinely odd features of the real historical case. 6 soldiers absent without leave is, in the ordinary course of military administration, a paperwork matter. It is handled at the unit level. There is a process. It does not generate a national response. What followed the disappearance of these men was a nationwide search involving federal law enforcement, described in the press within days, with a level of urgency ordinarily reserved for something far more serious than an administrative absence. In our story, of course, we know why. The tape was gone. Somebody, on the morning of July 17th, went into the archive at Site 13 and found a gap on the 3rd shelf and made a phone call, and that phone call went somewhere with real authority attached to it. But here is the elegant, awful thing about the position the programme was in, and it is my favourite piece of reasoning in the entire construction of this story. They could not tell anybody what they were actually looking for. The whole apparatus of federal law enforcement could be pointed at these men, but it could not be told why. The FBI could be asked to find 6 soldiers. It could not be told that those 6 soldiers were carrying a videotape from a programme whose existence could not be acknowledged to the agency doing the searching. So the search proceeded under a cover story, and the cover story had to be strong enough to justify the resources without explaining them. Which is where, in our fiction, the religious angle comes from. Think about it from the perspective of the people managing this problem. You need a public explanation for 6 elite soldiers vanishing simultaneously. The explanation must account for the coordination, because 6 men leaving together needs a shared cause. It must be non-political, because a political motive invites investigation. It must be embarrassing rather than sinister, because embarrassment closes stories and sinister opens them. And ideally, it should make the men themselves less credible, so that if they do talk, they talk from inside a frame that has already been built around them. An apocalyptic religious conviction does all 4 of those things at once. It is a beautiful cover story. It is coordinated, apolitical, embarrassing, and discrediting. And it costs nothing, because the men cannot deny it without explaining what they were actually doing, which is precisely what they cannot say. In our fiction, that is what happened. Somebody sat in a room and solved the problem the way a person solves a problem at work, and by the end of the first week that solution was in every newspaper in the country. Part 18. The safe houses. They did not do it alone. This is the part of the story that people find hardest to accept, and that I think is, in a strange way, the most realistic element in it. Because here is a thing that is true about large secret programs. They have alumni. Every classified project that runs for 19 years produces a steady output of people who leave. They retire, they transfer, they get sick, they get old, they get tired, they get a better offer, and they walk out carrying everything they know into a life where they are permitted to say none of it. Some of them make peace with that, some of them do not. In our story, the 6 men found the ones who did not. The first contact came in Alabama 4 days out. A man in his 70s, living alone, who had been given their description and a phone number by someone else who had been given it by someone else, along a chain that had apparently existed, dormant and unused, for a very long time. He fed them. He let them sleep in a back room with the shades drawn. He asked no questions about what they had seen, which was itself the most informative thing about him. And on the second night, as they were leaving, he said the sentence that reframed the entire story for them. He said, "You're not the first unit that stumbled into Site 13. Rourke asked him what he meant. The old man said that there had been others. He named no names and gave no dates beyond a decade. He said that in the 1970s, more than once, personnel assigned to perimeter work at that facility had reached the same conclusion these 6 had reached. Rourke asked what happened to them, and the old man said the thing that made all 6 of them understand, finally and completely, exactly how thin the ice was under their feet. He said, "Nothing happened to them. That's the point. Nothing ever happened to them at all. No arrests, no trials, no headlines, no record. They had gone from being men with careers and families and mailing addresses to being nothing whatsoever, in the paperwork sense. and the transition had been so administratively clean that there was no seam anywhere to catch a fingernail on. Which meant, the old man said, that the 6 of them had done exactly the right thing by going loud. Going loud was the only protection available. A man the whole country is looking for is a man who cannot quietly stop existing. The manhunt that was hunting them was also, in the strangest possible way, the thing keeping them alive. Part 19, Operation Clean Sweep. While the 6 men moved west, something else was happening behind them, and in our story it has a name: Operation Clean Sweep. It was not, in the fiction, a dramatic undertaking. It was again administrative. It was a small group of people with the authority to modify records, working steadily through a checklist over the course of several months. Construction contracts for the Eastern Range were reviewed and, where necessary, amended. Certain contracts were found to contain clerical errors regarding site designation and were corrected. The corrections had the effect of relocating, on paper, several $1 million of construction work from one part of the reservation to another. Environmental survey records were similarly reviewed. A survey conducted in 1983 that noted an anomalous thermal signature in a particular grid square was determined to have been the result of equipment calibration error and was superseded. Satellite imagery held by civilian agencies was addressed through a routine national security exemption process, resulting in the substitution of certain frames with imagery from adjacent dates. Personnel actions were the largest part of the effort. Between August of 1990 and March of 1991, in our fiction, 41 individuals connected to Project Gulf Star separated from federal service or their associated contractors. The separations were spread out. They were individually unremarkable. Retirements, transfers, a few resignations to pursue opportunities in the private sector. Nothing about any one of them would draw attention. Only the pattern is visible, and only if you already know to look for it, and by the time anyone knew to look for it, the pattern was 15 years old, and the people in it were scattered across a continent. And the facility itself? The facility in our story was not destroyed. Destruction is loud. Destruction leaves debris, and debris is evidence. The facility was decommissioned according to standard procedure. The interior equipment was removed over a period of 5 months. The ring was disassembled and its components were dispersed to 11 different storage locations under separate inventory numbers, and then the building was filled, poured, over the course of a summer, with a low-grade concrete slurry, from the floor to a depth sufficient to entomb the sublevel entirely. The structure above was then demolished conventionally, the debris removed, and the site graded flat. Within 4 years the pines had come back. By 1994 there was nothing at that coordinate but forest, and 30 feet beneath the forest floor there was a solid mass of concrete in the shape of a room that officially had never been built. Part 20. Rebecca Sloan. The journalist in our story was named Rebecca Sloan. She was 38 years old. She worked for a mid-sized newspaper in the southwest, and she had spent 4 years on defence procurement, which is the least glamorous beat in American journalism, and, for exactly that reason, the most dangerous one to the people it covers. Procurement reporting is not about secrets. It is about money. It is about reading appropriations documents and noticing that a line item labelled facility maintenance in one district has grown by 400% in 6 years while the facilities in that district have not changed. It is arithmetic, and arithmetic, unlike a leaked document, cannot be denied. Sloan had, before any of this happened, already noticed something about the Eglin reservation. She had noticed it the way you notice a rounding error, which is to say faintly, and without knowing what it meant. The contact came in the 4th week. A payphone. A conversation of under 2 minutes in which a man who would not give his name described, in terms she found bizarre and specific, a facility on a range in Florida, and asked her whether she would be willing to receive a videotape. She said yes. She said yes for the reason any reporter says yes, which is that the alternative is never finding out. The arrangement took 11 days to construct, and the caution on both sides was extraordinary. No addresses, no name locations in any conversation. A meeting point identified through a sequence of 3 separate calls to 3 separate payphones over 2 days. The location, finally, was a parking area at the edge of a public campground in a national forest at a specific time in the early afternoon. Sloane arrived 40 minutes early, which was the correct professional instinct and made no difference at all. The soldier arrived on foot. They spoke for perhaps 6 minutes. He was, she wrote later, not what she expected. She had prepared herself as someone frantic. Instead, she found a man who was calm, precise, and enormously tired, who gave her a compressed and orderly account of the last month of his life in the flat voice of someone delivering a report. He had the tape in a canvas bag. He did not hand it over immediately, and this is where the thing went wrong, and the reason it went wrong is so ordinary that it is almost unbearable. He wanted to tell her what was on it first. He wanted her to understand what she was accepting before she accepted it. He believed correctly that a person handed an object without context will not know what to do with it. That conversation cost them 4 minutes. At the end of the 4th minute, a vehicle entered the parking area. Sloane wrote later that the thing she remembered most was how unremarkable it was. It was not black. It had no antennas. It was a mid-sized sedan of a common make, and 2 men got out of it, and they were dressed like people on vacation, and they walked toward her car without hurrying. The soldier was already moving. He said one thing to her before he went. She recorded it in her notes that evening, and it is the only direct quotation from any of the 6 men in this entire story that Sloane ever published. He said, "Don't try to find me. Find the site." And then he was in the tree line, and the 2 men were running, and Rebecca Sloane was standing alone beside her car in a national forest with her hands empty. He got away. That much she knew, because she was still standing there 20 minutes later when the 2 men came back out of the woods, and their faces told her everything. But the bag was gone with him, and the tape was in the bag. Part 21. The Surrender. They came in over the following months, not together in the end, separately in different jurisdictions over a period of weeks. Each one walked in voluntarily. There was no confrontation, no standoff, no violence of any kind. They were taken into military custody. They were charged, as expected, with being absent without leave. And here the story hands the microphone back to the historical record, because what happened in those proceedings is a matter of public fact. They were prosecuted. The matter concluded. The press, which had covered the disappearance heavily, covered the resolution briefly, because resolutions are always smaller stories than mysteries. The narrative that survived was the one that had been built in the first week. 6 Green Berets, gripped by a shared apocalyptic conviction, walked off a base and were eventually rounded up. A strange story, a sad story, a story about the fragility of belief. And in our fiction, that outcome was not a failure of the cover-up. It was the cover-up completing itself. Because the most effective way to bury something is not to deny it. Denial is a signal. Denial tells people there is something to deny. The most effective way to bury something is to replace it with a smaller story that is embarrassing, complete, and boring. Nobody investigates a resolved story. Nobody files a records request about a matter that has an ending. The file closes, and the closing of the file is the burial. That is the thesis of this entire episode, and I want to state it plainly, because it is the thing worth taking with you into sleep tonight. In this story, the conspiracy did not win by hiding the truth. It won by giving everyone a lesser truth to be satisfied with. Part 22. The Box. 30 years passed. The Soviet Union ended. The Gulf War began and ended and began again in a different form. The internet arrived and rearranged what a secret was and how long one could last. The men of the Gulf Six got older, in whatever lives they built afterward, and did not say anything, and became a footnote in a certain kind of book about a certain kind of strangeness. And in the spring of a recent year, a historian named Daniel Reeves went to an estate sale in Pensacola, Florida. Reeves was not a conspiracy researcher. He was, in our story, an academic historian specializing in the industrial and infrastructural history of the Gulf Coast. His interest was in how the enormous federal presence in the Panhandle had reshaped the region economically over the 20th century. He wrote papers that were read by perhaps 400 people. Estate sales are, for a historian of that kind, a legitimate research method. The people who did the work of the 20th century are dying now, and their papers go into boxes, and the boxes go onto folding tables in driveways. The estate was that of a man who had worked in facilities engineering for a federal contractor for 31 years. Reeves paid $12 for 4 boxes of paper. 3 of them were exactly what he had hoped for and exactly what he expected. Contracts, invoices, site surveys, the ordinary sediment of a working life in infrastructure. The 4th box was different. It contained maps of restricted portions of the Eglin Range, at a scale and level of detail Reeves had never seen in a public document. It contained a set of engineering drawings, partial, with the title block removed, bearing an annotation on the margin of one sheet reading Gravitational Containment, Section Detail. It contained correspondence, fragmentary, from which 2 words could be recovered across 3 separate letters, and those 2 words were Gulf Star. And it contained a single sheet of ordinary lined notebook paper on which someone had written, in ballpoint pen, in a hand that was neat and slightly shaky, 1 sentence. The 6 saw the prototype. Reeves sat on the floor of his office with that page in his hand for a long time. He was, by training and temperament, a skeptic. His first assumption was that it was a hoax, or a collection of unrelated documents that a previous owner had assembled into a false pattern. But he was also a historian, and historians have one instinct that overrides skepticism, and that instinct is, check the ground. Because paper lies, maps lie, correspondence lies, dirt does not. Part 23. Beneath the Sand. It took Reeves 14 months to get onto the range, not through any dramatic subterfuge, through the ordinary process by which academics get access to federal land, which involves a research proposal, an institutional affiliation, a stated purpose, and a great deal of waiting. His stated purpose was an archaeological and historical survey of mid-century infrastructure on the reservation, which was entirely true. He was granted access to portions of the Eastern Range, escorted on 3 days in October. He brought ground-penetrating radar. That too was unremarkable. GPR is standard equipment for exactly the kind of survey he had described. It is how you find old foundations, buried utility runs, the outlines of demolished structures. It is a tool for locating things that used to be there. The coordinate from the map was in a stand of pine, perhaps 40 years old, indistinguishable from the forest around it. The first pass told him something was there. The second pass told him what. The subsurface return showed a continuous mass beginning at a depth of approximately 9 feet and extending downward beyond the effective range of his equipment. It had edges. It had a shape. The shape was rectangular in outline, approximately 140 feet by 220 feet, and within that rectangle, at a depth he estimated at 22 feet, there was a circular void or density anomaly, centred, with a diameter that his software placed between 68 and 74 feet. Reeves stood in a stand of pines in the Florida Panhandle, looking at a screen showing him a perfect circle buried under a forest. He did what any honest researcher does. He checked the records. The construction history of that grid square, per the documentation available to him, showed no structures, ever. The square was listed as undeveloped, having been surveyed in 1952 and again in 1996 with no improvements noted in either survey. There is a phrase for what he was looking at that Reeves used in his notes, and that I think is the perfect description of this entire genre of story. He wrote, "There is a building here that has never existed." Part 24. why they really left. Reeves spent the following 2 years assembling the rest. He never got a document that proved anything. He never found a smoking gun, and by the nature of the thing he was looking at, no such document was ever going to exist. What he assembled instead was a shape made entirely out of absences, missing pages, renumbered binders, personnel who retired in unusual clusters, contracts that had been corrected, a grid square that had been surveyed twice and found empty both times, and a survey report from 1983 that was referenced in an index but was not in the file. And what he concluded at the end of it was this: the 6 men did not run because they were frightened of the technology. That is the version people always assume, and it is wrong, and the difference matters. They ran because of what the technology implied about the world they were about to be living in. Consider it clearly. A machine that can shape space is not primarily a vehicle. It is a delivery system. Its first and most obvious application is not exploration. It is the movement of things from one place to another without crossing the distance between. Every strategic arrangement in the 20th century rested on the fact that distance is real. Deterrence works because a weapon must travel, and travel takes time, and time permits detection, and detection permits response. Every early warning system, every treaty, every hard-won piece of arms control architecture sits on the assumption that things must cross the space between here and there. Remove that assumption, and everything built on top of it falls at once, not gradually, instantaneously, in the moment the capability becomes real, and silently, because the first party to hold it has overwhelming reason to say nothing. That is what the 6 men understood in the summer of 1990, standing in a hangar in Florida, watching a plate hang in the air. They were not looking at a marvel. They were looking at the end of warning, and they made a calculation that soldiers are, in fact, specifically trained to make. They calculated that the thing they had sworn to protect was not the program. It was the country, and the country included the arrangement that kept the country from being erased in an afternoon. They decided that the only defensible act was to make the thing public, because a capability that everyone knows about is a capability that can be negotiated, and a capability that only one party knows about is a capability that will be used. They failed. That is the ending. They failed, and they were prosecuted for absence without leave, and the story that survived them was a story about 6 confused men chasing the end of the world. Part 25. The Last Tape. The package arrived at Daniel Reeves' office on an ordinary Tuesday. A padded envelope, no return address, a postmark from a city he had no connection to. Inside was a videotape, not the original. The original format had been half-inch industrial videotape, and this was a modern digital transfer on physical media, along with a single sheet of paper bearing nothing but a handwritten line reading that the source material had been restored from a degraded copy, and that some portions were unrecoverable. The label on the case had been reproduced from the original. It read, Site 13, Test 7. Reeves watched it that night, alone, in his office, with the door locked, which he later admitted was an absurd precaution and which he could not talk himself out of. The footage ran for 19 minutes. The first 14 were an engineering record, dull in the way all engineering records are. A fixed camera on a tripod, a view of a large interior space, a circular structure at the centre, technical call-outs on a whiteboard in the corner of the frame, too distant to read, time code running in the lower right. At minute 14, the picture began to degrade. Not the tape, the picture. The image of the room itself became difficult in a way Reeves struggled to describe. The straight lines of the scaffolding acquired a curvature that increased toward the centre of the frame. The proportions of the room stopped being consistent from one side of the image to the other. At minute 15 and 40 seconds, the far wall of the chamber was no longer there. Reeves stopped the playback and went back and watched that section 11 times. For a duration he measured at approximately 1.5 seconds. The wall at the rear of the frame was replaced by an area of the image that was not the wall. It was not black. It was not static. It was by his description exterior. There was a horizon in it. There was a ground plane of some kind, textured and pale, and the light in it was wrong. The light was the deep, saturated red of a sun very low in a sky full of dust. Then the wall was back. The remaining 3 minutes of the recording were the aftermath. People moving quickly, the camera being jostled, the audio, which had been ambient room noise throughout, becoming a confusion of voices, and at the very end, at minute 18 and 51 seconds, a figure walked into the frame and stopped and looked directly into the lens. He was in uniform. He was young. He was unmistakably a soldier. He looked at the camera for 4 seconds. Then he said one sentence, and it is the last thing on the tape. He said, "If you're watching this, they succeeded in convincing everyone we deserted." And the screen turns to static. Part 26, The Reflection. So, here is where we leave it. Not with proof, because there is no proof, and there was never going to be. That is not what this kind of story offers. What it offers is a shape. And I want to leave you with the shape rather than the answer, because the shape is the thing that stays with a person, and because I have been honest with you all night about what is real here, and I'm not going to spoil that in the last 5 minutes by pretending the story is anything other than what it is. Here is what is true. 6 real men, extraordinarily well trained, psychologically screened, professionally successful, walked off a military base in Florida together on a July morning in 1990, and a nationwide search followed, and the explanation the world received was about the end of days. That happened. That is documented. And it remains, 36 years later, genuinely strange. Everything else tonight was ours. The hangar, the ring, the physicist, the tape, Rebecca Sloan, Daniel Reeves, and the circle buried under the pines. We built all of it, together, and I hope it did what it was supposed to do, which was to hold your attention just gently enough that it eventually let go of you. But the thing underneath the story is not fictional, and it is the thing I would like you to carry down with you, which is this. Large institutions do not usually hide things by lying. Lying is expensive and fragile, and it requires everybody involved to remember the same falsehood forever. They hide things by being enormous and slow and boring. They hide things in the sheer volume of paper. They hide things by making the true story so tedious to assemble that no reasonable person would spend a life assembling it. They hide things by offering at exactly the right moment a smaller and more comfortable explanation that lets everyone close the file and go home. The most effective secret in the world is not a locked vault. It is a resolved case. And that is worth remembering, not because there is a buried circle in the Florida sand, but because there are 10,000 ordinary, unremarkable, entirely non-conspiratorial situations in every one of our lives where the same principle quietly applies. The file that closed a little too neatly, the explanation that arrived a little too quickly and fit a little too well. Sometimes it is just what it looks like, but it is worth noticing when it is not. All right, that is enough thinking for one night. Let all of that go now. Let the hangar go, and the pines, and the 6 men on the road heading west with a tape in a canvas bag, and their whole lives already spent. Let the room around you be exactly the size it is. Let the ceiling be at its ordinary distance. Let the walls stay where they are. Feel the weight of your body against whatever is holding it up, and notice that you do not have to hold yourself up at all. That has been taken care of. It has been taken care of the entire time. Breathe in slowly and let it go out on its own without pushing it. Again, let the jaw unclench. Let the shoulders drop one more time, because they have crept back up while you were listening. They always do. There is nothing left for you to do tonight. Nothing needs solving. The file is closed, and this time that is a good thing. Before we begin tonight, a quick shout out to Benji who suggested this topic, and to everyone else. If you're listening on Spotify, please take 10 seconds to leave us a review. It genuinely means the world, and it helps more people find this channel than you might think. Now, close your eyes for a moment. Picture the ocean, not the beach, not the shore, not sunlight dancing on shallow water. Picture the deep ocean, the kind of ocean that has no floor you can see, the kind where darkness begins 30 feet below the surface and stretches down for miles into cold, crushing black. The kind of ocean that does not care about you. Now picture that ocean doing something impossible. Folding, not violently, not dramatically, slowly, quietly, like paper being pressed between two enormous hands somewhere far beneath the surface. A fold so vast it affects not just water, but space. Not just space, but time. Now picture a ship sailing through that fold. The crew does not feel anything unusual at first. The compass begins to drift. The GPS loses its satellites. The depth sounder shows numbers that make no sense. 30 feet, then 3,000 feet, then nothing at all. Then the sky changes colour. Not darker, not stormier, older, as if the sunlight reaching the deck has travelled through a different century before arriving. And then the ship is gone. Not sunk, not wrecked, just gone. That is the Bermuda Triangle as most people understand it. A place where things disappear. A cursed stretch of ocean between Miami, Bermuda and Puerto Rico, where ships and aircraft vanish without explanation, where compasses spin, where rescue crews find nothing but open water. But what if the triangle itself, the shape, the name, the story, was the distraction? What if the real phenomenon is not a triangle at all? What if it is something far older, far stranger, and far more terrifying, buried not in the sky above the ocean, but in the rock beneath it? Tonight, we go deeper than the legend. Tonight, we follow the corridor. The Bermuda Triangle entered public consciousness not through government reports or scientific discovery, but through a magazine. In February of 1964, a writer named Vincent Gaddis published an article in Argosy magazine. He drew a triangle on a map connecting Miami, Bermuda and Puerto Rico. He called it the Deadly Bermuda Triangle. He listed the disappearances, he described the mystery, and he gave the public something they had never had before, a shape to be afraid of. A triangle is a remarkable thing to fear. It is precise, geometric. It has corners and edges and a definable interior. It can be drawn on a map, coloured in and pointed to. It gives the mystery a boundary, a territory. It makes the unknown feel knowable, even if only as a zone of danger. The public loved it. Books followed. Television specials followed. Charles Berlitz published a best-selling book in 1974 titled simply The Bermuda Triangle, which sold millions of copies and cemented the legend into popular culture. By the 1980s, the Bermuda Triangle had become one of the most recognisable paranormal concepts in the world, sitting comfortably alongside UFOs, Bigfoot, and the Loch Ness Monster in the hierarchy of beloved mysteries. But here is what the books did not tell you. The triangle was invented, not the disappearances. Those were real, or at least documented. But the triangle shape itself, that precise geometric boundary, was a literary device, a way to contain and organise a collection of unrelated incidents spanning decades and different weather conditions and different vessel types and different navigational eras. When researchers began plotting the actual disappearances on maps without the pre-drawn triangle, something immediately strange emerged. The incidents did not cluster inside the triangle. They clustered along a line, a corridor, a curved, irregular path running through the Western Atlantic, hugging the edge of the continental shelf, passing over areas of unusual seafloor topology, crossing regions where magnetic readings had always been slightly wrong. The triangle was not an accident of geography, it was an accident of storytelling. And now, decades later, a retired oceanographer named Dr. Elias Marrow a man who had spent his career mapping the ocean floor for the United States Navy, is sitting in a small apartment in coastal Virginia, surrounded by old survey documents, magnetic readings, and naval logs that were never meant to be read by civilian eyes. He's not a believer in the paranormal. He is a scientist who has spent his entire professional life explaining the ocean with data. But the data he is looking at right now is not explaining anything. It is asking a question. And the question is this: what is buried beneath the Atlantic that turns on and off like a machine? To understand what Marrow finds, you first have to understand the incident that started everything. December 5th, 1945. Naval Air Station, Fort Lauderdale, Florida. 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers sit on the runway in the late afternoon light, engines warming. The pilots are students mostly. The mission is routine, a training exercise, a navigation triangle over the ocean, the kind of flight they have done dozens of times before. The lead plane is piloted by Lieutenant Charles Taylor, an experienced aviator with more than 2,500 hours of flight time. They call the flight Flight 19. They take off at 2:14 in the afternoon. 2 hours later, the air traffic control tower at Fort Lauderdale receives a transmission from Taylor that no one expects. Calling tower. This is an emergency. We seem to be off course. We cannot see land. The tower responds. Taylor's transmissions are fragmented, patchy, interrupted by static that the controllers find unusual for the atmospheric conditions. What follows over the next several hours is a slow, strange unravelling. Taylor reports that his compasses are not working correctly. He believes, based on the landmarks he can see below, that he is over the Florida Keys, a chain of islands southwest of Miami. Controllers suspect he is actually over the Bahamas, which would put him east and northeast of his intended position. If Taylor is right, he needs to fly north to return to the mainland. If the controllers are right, he needs to fly northwest. Taylor continues flying as if he is over the Keys. Transmissions grow fainter as the planes move further from shore. At approximately 6:45 in the evening, the last transmission from Flight 19 is received. No wreckage is ever found, no bodies, no oil slick, no debris field. 5 aircraft and 14 men simply cease to exist, and then the search begins. A PBM Mariner flying boat, a large reliable aircraft, is dispatched to search the last known area of the flight. The Mariner does not return either. No mayday call is received, no distress signal. It vanishes as completely as Flight 19. A ship in the area later reports seeing a brief explosion in the sky at the time the Mariner would have been in the region. The official investigation concludes the aircraft possibly exploded due to a fuel leak. PBM Mariners were known to sometimes accumulate flammable fumes. The official explanation for Flight 19 involves navigational error, fuel exhaustion, worsening sea conditions, and the likelihood that the aircraft ditched in open water under conditions that prevented recovery. For most skeptics, this is enough. For Marrow, it is the beginning. Because when he overlays the last known position, estimates of Flight 19 onto his magnetic anomaly maps, something unexpected appears. Taylor's reported compass confusion is consistent with a localized magnetic disturbance. Not a permanent magnetic variation. Those are charted, known, accounted for by any competent navigator. A transient one. A temporary deviation that appears, affects compass readings, and then stops. Taylor was not incompetent. He was not lost in the ordinary sense. His compass was telling him something was north that was not north, and Flight 19 flew into the ocean, because the ocean briefly rearranged its own directions. Dr. Elias Marrow did not go looking for the Bermuda Triangle. The Bermuda Triangle came to him. In the winter of 2019, Marrow receives a package from the estate of his former colleague, Dr. Raymond Voss. Voss had been a geomagnetic survey specialist with the Naval Oceanographic Office during the 1960s and 70s, working on classified projects that were never fully declassified. He died quietly in a retirement community in Annapolis without ever speaking publicly about his work. The box Voss leaves Marrow contains survey documents, sonar printouts, and handwritten notes. Most of it is familiar, the ordinary documentation of ocean floor mapping. But one folder is different. It is labelled only with a designation, B7. Inside are partial scans of a seafloor region east of the Bahamas at a depth of approximately 9,000 feet. The scans are from 1972, taken using then state-of-the-art side-scan sonar technology. They are incomplete. The scan covers only a portion of the area, as if the survey vessel was redirected before it could finish. What is visible in the scan is strange. The seafloor in that area contains long, parallel formations running in one direction, crossed at regular intervals by perpendicular structures. The overall pattern creates something resembling a vast calibration grid, a series of channels and ridges arranged with a symmetry that does not match the natural geology of the region. Natural seafloor formations in the Atlantic at that depth are typically irregular. Volcanic ridges, sediment flows, fault scarps. They have texture and variation. They meander. These do not meander. They are parallel. They are consistent. They repeat. Marrow is not a man who jumps to conclusions. He spends months looking for a natural geological explanation. He considers the possibility that the formations are an artifact of the sonar equipment, an imaging error. He considers columnar jointing, a natural process where volcanic rock cools into regular geometric columns. He rules them all out. The scale is too large. The regularity is too precise. The depth is inconsistent with volcanic activity in the region. And then he finds Voss's handwritten note at the back of the folder. It says, "Not geological, not recent, not ours. Recommend no further investigation, not ours." 2 words that send Marrow's career in a completely different direction. He begins mapping every documented Bermuda Triangle incident he can find against his new reference point, seafloor formation B7. He maps weather data, magnetic readings, reported compass anomalies, last known coordinates, and the dates and solar conditions at the time of each disappearance. The correlation is not perfect. It is messy and statistical, the way real patterns always are. But it is there. The incidents cluster above and around B7 in a way that cannot be explained by chance alone. Whatever is buried beneath the Atlantic seafloor east of the Bahamas, it appears to be doing something. Something that occasionally, temporarily, catastrophically interferes with navigation. Something that has been doing it for a very long time. Magnetic variation is a well-understood phenomenon. The Earth's magnetic field is not uniform. It has regions of stronger and weaker intensity, areas where compass readings deviate from true geographic north by predictable amounts. These variations are mapped, charted, updated regularly, and accounted for in every modern navigation system. A ship's navigator in the Western Atlantic knows exactly how much to correct for magnetic variation. This is not what Marrow is looking for. He is looking for something different, something the official charts do not and cannot account for, because it does not stay in one place. He calls them transient anomalies, brief, localized episodes of unusual magnetic behavior that appear in a region for a limited time and then dissipate. They are not mythological. They are documented, if rarely and quietly. Marrow finds a reference in a 1963 naval survey log that was partially declassified in the 1990s, without attracting much public attention. The note, written by a survey officer during a routine Atlantic crossing, reads, "Unusual compass behaviour observed. Duration approximately 11 minutes. Deviation exceeded expected variation by a factor of approximately 12. No meteorological explanation identified. Logged as instrument anomaly pending review." Instrument anomaly pending review. That is how official documents handle the inexplicable. Not with drama. With the most boring possible explanation, filed and forgotten. But Marrow finds more of them. Not many. They are scattered through decades of maritime and naval records, each one individually explainable as equipment malfunction or human error, each one buried in a footnote or appendix. But together they form a pattern. The transient anomalies appear to pulse. They occur more frequently during periods of elevated solar activity. They intensify during certain tidal cycles. They cluster, not randomly, but along the same curved corridor that runs above B7. Marrow begins to understand what he's looking at. Not a constant danger, a periodic one. The Bermuda Triangle does not operate all the time. It cannot. If it did, the Atlantic would be ungovernable, and the scale of disappearances would be vastly larger than the historical record shows. It activates. Under the right combination of conditions, solar pressure, tidal stress, deep ocean currents, something beneath the seafloor generates a temporary magnetic disturbance strong enough to confuse navigation instruments, disorient pilots and sailors, and in extreme cases create what Marrow begins to call a navigational void, a volume of space in which compass direction, GPS positioning, and even human spatial orientation become unreliable. For a ship caught in a navigational void, north is not north. For an aircraft caught in one, up is not necessarily up. For a crew caught in one, the horizon itself cannot be trusted. And in 1945, when Flight 19's compass began to spin, Lieutenant Taylor was not confused. He was right. His compass was pointing somewhere else entirely. The 1950s and 1960s were the golden age of underwater listening. As the Cold War intensified, the United States Navy expanded an extraordinary surveillance network across the Atlantic Ocean. The Sound Surveillance System, known as SOSUS, was a series of hydrophone arrays anchored to the ocean floor, stretching across the Atlantic in long chains, listening for the acoustic signature of Soviet submarines. It was one of the most ambitious and classified intelligence programs in American history, and it worked. SOSUS gave the Navy an unprecedented picture of submarine activity in the Atlantic, tracking Soviet vessels from thousands of miles away. But in the course of building and monitoring this network, the Navy discovered something they had not been looking for. Certain regions of the Atlantic produce strange acoustic behaviour. Sonar returns that arrived before they were sent. Echoes that came from empty water. Transmissions that bounced in physically impossible directions. Certain fixed hydrophones occasionally recorded sounds that analysis teams could not identify. Not biological, not mechanical, not geological in any conventional sense. Marrow uncovers references to a classified program that ran parallel to SOSUS from approximately 1958 to 1971. This program, which he finds referenced only obliquely in the documents Voss left him, is designated Project Deep Compass. Where SOSUS tracked submarines, Deep Compass studied the anomalies. The program focused on a specific zone of the Atlantic where acoustic and magnetic behaviour consistently defied modelling. Submarines running through certain coordinates reported events that were quietly documented and quietly classified. Crew members reported experiencing intense disorientation, not dizziness, not illness, but a sensation of directional confusion. Veterans of dozens of ocean deployments described the feeling as walking into a room and suddenly being unable to determine which wall was the floor. Clock drift was documented. In several cases, chronometers aboard vessels passing through the zone showed measurable time discrepancies that could not be accounted for by mechanical failure. Sonar echoes returned in the wrong order. Sequences of sound that should have arrived in a specific temporal pattern arriving scrambled, as if the sequence of cause and effect had been briefly shuffled. One classified note from a Deep Compass researcher, a single paragraph partially redacted, describes the phenomenon in language that Marrow finds remarkable for a government document from the 1960s. Propagation behaviour in the study zone suggests localised space-time metric distortion, consistent with intense gravitational or electromagnetic field gradient. This interpretation is rejected as physically impossible. Alternative explanations under investigation. Localised space-time metric distortion, rejected as physically impossible. Alternative explanations under investigation. Marrow reads that paragraph approximately 40 times before he puts it down, because what the Deep Compass researcher was describing in the cautious and deniable language of classified bureaucracy was a region of the ocean where the normal rules of physics briefly failed to apply. Not in a science fiction way, in a measurable, documentable, terrifying way, and the Navy knew. Here is where Marrow's research takes its strangest turn. The popular mythology of the Bermuda Triangle focuses almost entirely on disappearances, things that go in and do not come out, ships that vanish, aircraft that cease to exist, people who are never found. But Marrow finds a different category of documented incident that receives almost no attention. He calls them returns, not disappearances, returns. The first case that catches his attention involves a commercial fishing vessel found adrift approximately 80 miles northeast of Nassau in 1967. The boat was in good condition. There was food on the table, still relatively fresh. The engine was operational, the radio was functional, the crew was gone, with no sign of struggle or illness, and the ship's chronometer, a precision clock, showed a time that was approximately 4 hours and 17 minutes behind the actual time at that location on that date. 4 hours and 17 minutes. 17. The investigation concluded the clock had malfunctioned, but Marrow notes that the clock was the ship's backup chronometer, used precisely because the primary clock had already failed. Both clocks, independent instruments, showing the same incorrect time, as if the ship had spent 4 extra hours somewhere the clocks could not reach. The second case involves a life raft found in 1973 floating in the Western Atlantic. The raft was in good condition, fully inflated, equipped with sealed emergency supplies that appeared unused. Maritime records showed no missing vessel report that matched the raft's type or configuration. The raft's identification number was traced to a vessel that had been reported missing in 1969, 4 years earlier. The raft looked new. The third case is perhaps the strangest. A distress call received by a Coast Guard station in 1978. The call gave a vessel name, a position, and a description of engine failure. Coast Guard vessels responded and found nothing. No vessel, no debris, clear weather, calm seas, routine, unexplained. But the frequency of the transmission, the call sign used, and details of the distress message matched a vessel that had been documented as missing in 1952, 26 years earlier. The official explanation was a hoax. Marrow does not think it was a hoax. He thinks the transmission was real. He thinks the 1952 vessel was caught in an activation event that displaced it through time, not to another dimension, not through a portal, but through the same kind of field distortion that Deep Compass researchers had observed bending acoustic propagation in the zone. If a sound wave can be displaced in time, if an echo can arrive before its source, then perhaps under sufficiently extreme conditions, the vessel generating that echo can be displaced too. Not destroyed, displaced. And occasionally briefly something comes back. Before the Cold War, before Flight 19, before radar, before radio was standard equipment on ocean vessels. The USS Cyclops. The Cyclops was a United States Navy collier, a bulk cargo vessel designed to carry coal and fuel to naval vessels at sea. In 1918, it was one of the largest ships in the naval fleet, measuring over 500 feet in length and displacing approximately 19,000 tons when fully loaded. In March of 1918, the Cyclops was carrying approximately 11,000 tons of manganese ore from Barbados to Baltimore. She carried a crew of 306 men under the command of Lieutenant Commander George Worley. She was never seen again. No distress call was received, no wreckage was found, no bodies were recovered. The ship did not encounter a submarine attack. Naval records for the period show no German submarine activity along the Cyclops' route. Weather in the region was described as moderate. The ship was in good condition. There was no obvious mechanical deficiency. 306 men. Gone. The Cyclops' disappearance remains one of the largest losses of life in United States naval history outside of combat. Despite extensive searches at the time and numerous subsequent investigations, no physical trace of the vessel has ever been definitively identified. When Marrow overlays the Cyclops' documented route against his anomaly model, The results are precise in a way that makes him uncomfortable. The Cyclops was sailing through a predicted activation corridor during a period of unusual geomagnetic disturbance, a period well documented in the scientific literature of the era, associated with elevated solar activity in the spring of 1918. The Navy did not create the anomaly beneath the Atlantic. The anomaly was there before the Navy existed, before the United States existed, before European ships crossed the Atlantic. Whatever is buried in the seafloor east of the Bahamas has been active for a very long time. The Cold War experiments did not produce the phenomenon, they found it. And when Marrow begins pulling the thread on what the Navy did after they found it, the story becomes darker. Because finding a natural phenomenon of this magnitude, a phenomenon that can misplace ships and aircraft, that can briefly distort the physics of a region of ocean, that appears to be tied to some ancient structure on the seafloor, does not lead to public disclosure. It leads to classification. It leads to a quiet effort to understand. And it leads to something worse, an attempt to harness it. Here is the thing about the Bermuda Triangle that no one talks about. The government did not suppress it. The opposite happened. The legend was allowed to grow. Not just allowed, encouraged. Not through direct government action, maybe, but through something more subtle and more effective, the complete saturation of public discourse with increasingly absurd explanations that made serious investigation impossible. Aliens abducting ships, Atlantis rising from the sea floor, sea monsters of impossible size, interdimensional portals, time warps created by ancient crystals, reversed gravity, underwater pyramids built by a lost civilization to harvest solar energy. Each new theory was more spectacular than the last. Each one drove the next wave of book deals and television specials and late-night radio programs. Each one ensured that anyone who stood up in a serious professional context and said, "I think there is a genuine unexplained physical phenomenon in the Western Atlantic that deserves rigorous scientific investigation," would be immediately lumped in with the people who believed the triangle was operated by extraterrestrial beings from the Pleiades. The cover-up was not silence. The cover-up was noise. Marrow realizes this is not a conspiracy in the traditional sense, not a room of men in dark suits choosing to distract the public. It is something more organic and more durable than that. The Navy kept its research classified because that is what the Navy does. The public filled the vacuum with mythology because that is what people do. The media amplified the mythology because it sold, and because that is what media does. And the result, a completely unintentional but extraordinarily effective result, was that by the 1980s, the Bermuda Triangle was so thoroughly associated with fringe culture that any scientist who investigated it seriously was immediately stigmatized. The mystery was too important to investigate, because investigating it meant being associated with people who had made it ridiculous. That is not a conspiracy. That is the most human thing in the world. And it is, Marrow concludes, precisely as effective as any conspiracy could ever be. Marrow obtains additional seafloor mapping data through channels he does not discuss in detail. Former colleagues, Freedom of Information requests that return heavily redacted documents, academic contacts at institutions with access to older naval survey archives. What he assembles, piece by piece, over 2 years of work, is a composite picture of Formation B7, and it is extraordinary. The structure spans approximately 47 miles in its longest dimension. It sits at a depth of between 8,500 and 9,800 feet. It is buried beneath a layer of sediment that, based on accumulation rates in the region, suggests it has been in place for at minimum tens of thousands of years, and possibly much longer. The formation consists of what appear to be long parallel channels, approximately 200 to 300 feet wide and between 60 and 120 feet deep, running in a consistent orientation and spaced at regular intervals of approximately half a mile. Crossing these channels at near perpendicular angles are secondary structures, shallower, narrower, more numerous, creating a grid pattern across the primary channels. The overall geometry is not random. The spacing between primary channels does not vary randomly. It follows a ratio. The ratio, when Marrow calculates it, is approximately 1.618. He stares at that number for a long time. 1.618, the golden ratio. He is not a man who attaches mystical significance to mathematics. The golden ratio appears throughout nature, in the spiral of a nautilus shell, the branching of trees, the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower. Its presence in the formation could indicate a natural geological process that Marrow has not yet identified. But it could also indicate something else, something intentional. Marrow does not know who built Formation B7. He does not know when. He does not know whether it was built at all, or whether it is a natural structure whose regularity exceeds anything previously documented in Atlantic seafloor geology. What he believes, based on years of analysis, is that the formation acts as a kind of transducer, a structure that converts one type of energy into another, specifically that it receives tidal, tectonic, and electromagnetic energy from the surrounding ocean and seafloor, and converts it into the transient magnetic disturbances he has been tracking. When it was first built or formed, perhaps this conversion process was smooth. Perhaps it served some purpose, regulating magnetic field intensity in the region, stabilizing some ancient geological process, doing something so large and so slow that human civilization developed and grew and built ships without ever noticing it. But it has been decaying. For thousands of years, possibly tens of thousands, the structure has been degrading, filling with sediment, cracking along its geometric lines, losing whatever precision it once had. And as it degrades, the energy conversion process it controls becomes less stable. Instead of smooth regulation, the structure produces pulses, sudden, intense, localized releases of electromagnetic energy that briefly but catastrophically distort the magnetic and possibly gravitational field in the ocean above it. The Bermuda Triangle is not a curse, it is a machine that is breaking down. Marrow's research might have remained theoretical, an old scientist's private obsession, unpublished and unknown, if not for a discovery made by a private salvage company operating in the Atlantic in the autumn of 2021. The salvage vessel was operating in an area well outside conventional shipping lanes, using remotely operated vehicles to survey a section of seafloor near the edge of a deep-water plateau. They were not looking for aircraft wreckage, but they found it. At a depth of approximately 6,000 feet, partially buried in sediment, they recovered the remains of a flight recorder, a black box, from an aircraft that could not be immediately identified. The recorder was heavily corroded, the memory unit was damaged, partial data was extracted. The salvage company, unsure of the legal implications, reported the discovery to maritime authorities and made available a partial transcript of the recovered audio, which was released in heavily redacted form to a small number of researchers. Marrow obtains a copy through a contact in the oceanographic community. Most of the transcript is corrupted beyond interpretation. Fragments of cockpit conversation, instrument readings, the kind of ordinary flight communication that fills black box recordings from every era of aviation. But two exchanges are intact. In the first, a voice, presumably the pilot, says, "The horizon is above us, not below us, not at our level, above us." A pilot reporting that the horizon is above the aircraft. In the second exchange, a different voice responds, "We are seeing water on both sides of an aircraft in flight." Marrow understands what these phrases describe. The pilots were experiencing a complete failure of spatial orientation, not the kind caused by cloud cover or unusual light conditions, but a fundamental inability to determine which direction was up. Not because they were confused, because the directions themselves had shifted. If a transient magnetic disturbance strong enough to disable compass readings had also, at its peak intensity, briefly altered the local gravitational gradient, the effect on a crew would be exactly this. The horizon would appear to move, the surface of the ocean would appear above, beside, or at impossible angles. The sky and the sea would become indistinguishable. For a few moments, an aircraft caught in a full activation event would be flying through a volume of space, in which the usual coordinates of the physical world had been temporarily rearranged. Marrow cannot identify the aircraft from the recovered data. The salvage company could not identify it either. No matching wreck registration has been found. The aircraft may have been unreported, or it may have been reported, decades before the wreck was found. By the spring of 2023, Marrow's model is complete enough to make a prediction. This is the step he's been both working toward and dreading. Prediction is the test of a theory, not anecdote, not pattern matching, not the retrospective correlation of old data. Prediction. If his model of Formation B7's activation conditions is correct, if the transient anomalies are caused by a specific combination of solar activity, tidal phase, and deep ocean pressure fluctuation, then the model should be able to predict when, and approximately where, the next significant activation event will occur, and it does. According to Marrow's calculations, an activation window of unusual intensity is approaching. In the late summer of 2023, the zone will not correspond to the classical Bermuda Triangle geography. It will be centered approximately 120 miles northeast of the Bahamas, in deeper water than most documented incidents, in a region that receives very little commercial or recreational traffic. The conditions will align for approximately 18 to 48 hours. The intensity, based on the solar forecast, the tidal calendar, and the deep current modelling Marrow has developed, will be higher than anything the model predicts for the preceding decade. He files reports with maritime regulatory bodies. The reports are politely acknowledged and quietly disregarded. The work of a retired scientist with no current institutional affiliation, making extraordinary claims without peer-reviewed publication. He contacts two former colleagues who still hold positions at research institutions. One does not respond. The other calls him privately and advises him with evident discomfort to be careful. Careful about what? About who else might be watching the same window. Marrow does not sleep well after that call. He makes a decision that any rational person would describe as unwise. He is going to the activation zone, not to prove his theory to the scientific establishment, to see it, to finally see, with his own instruments and his own eyes, what has been hiding beneath the Atlantic for longer than human civilization has existed. The vessel is a 60-foot research boat, borrowed from a former student who now operates a marine survey company. The crew consists of Marrow and 4 skeptics he recruited specifically because he does not want people who already believe him. He wants people who will challenge every reading, who will insist on conventional explanations until conventional explanations become impossible. They set out from Nassau in the early morning. The weather is clear, the ocean is gentle, the sky is the particular shade of blue that makes people fall in love with the sea and forget it has depths no human has ever seen. For the first 18 hours, nothing happens. The crew is professionally sceptical. 2 of them are openly amused by the expedition. One keeps a running log of entirely normal instrument readings, annotated with dry commentary. The mood is collegial and slightly condescending toward Marrow, in the way that the young and certain tend toward the old and obsessed. Then, at approximately 3 in the morning on the second day, the first instrument anomaly appears. The GPS loses its satellite connection. Not completely. It flickers. 4 satellites, then 2, then none, then 4 again. The position display stutters between 3 different coordinates, none of which agree with each other. The crew member who has been keeping the ironic log stops making ironic comments. They switch to the backup GPS. It shows the same behaviour. Then the compass begins to drift. Not spin wildly, nothing dramatic. A slow, smooth rotation, like a clock moving in the wrong direction. Marrow watches the crew member responsible for navigation check and recheck the instrument. Tap it. Hold a reference magnet near it to verify it responds to external magnetic fields. The compass responds correctly to the reference magnet. It responds incorrectly to the Earth. The depth sounder begins producing readings that no one can make sense of. The seafloor in this region is at approximately 8,000 feet. The depth sounder shows 4,000 feet, then 12,000. Then, for a period of approximately 7 minutes, it shows no return at all, as if there is no seafloor beneath the vessel, as if the ocean goes down forever. Then it shows 30 feet. 30 feet of water, here, in the middle of the Atlantic, miles from any shallow bank or reef. No one on the boat says anything for a long moment, and then the sky changes. It is not a storm. It is not cloud cover. The sky does not darken. It changes colour in a way that none of the crew can adequately describe later. The best description Marrow records in his notes is this: the light is wrong. Not less of it. Not more. Wrong. Like looking at a familiar room through glass that was ground slightly incorrectly. Everything is present, but nothing is quite the colour it should be. One crew member describes it as looking at sunlight that has passed through water. Another describes it as the colour of old photographs. Not sepia, not black and white, but the particular warmth of a photograph taken decades before the one looking at it was born. Marrow, standing at the stern of the vessel looking at the ocean surface around the boat, notices something he has no immediate framework to explain. The waves are not moving correctly. They are present. They are real. He can feel them. The boat is responding to them. But their motion appears slightly delayed, as if watched through a medium that slows transmission. Not the waves themselves, but his perception of them. Later, reviewing the timestamps on the instrument logs from this period, Marrow will find a discrepancy that he cannot fully account for even with his own model. The anomalous readings, the compass deviation, the GPS failure, the depth sounder impossibilities, the light change, last for what the instruments record as approximately 41 minutes. The crew's subjective experience of this period is approximately 12 minutes. 29 minutes are missing. Not in the sense that anyone lost consciousness. Not in the sense that memory was disrupted. In the sense that 41 minutes of clock time passed while 12 minutes of subjective time were experienced. Time, inside the activation zone, runs at a different rate. Not dramatically. Not enough to be noticed moment to moment, but measurably, undeniably different. At the peak of the activation event, Marrow's radio receives a transmission. It comes in on a frequency that no one is using, a frequency associated with military aviation communication from an earlier era, not currently in active use. The voice on the transmission is a man's voice. The audio quality is poor, heavy static, the particular texture of analog radio transmission from the mid-20th century, before digital systems, before satellite communication. The man sounds frightened. He is reporting compass failure. He is reporting that he cannot identify his position. He is asking for guidance. One of Marrow's crew, a woman with a background in aviation communications, listens for a moment and then goes very still. She says, "That is the phonetic alphabet from before 1956. The United States military changed its phonetic alphabet in 1956. What is being spoken on the radio is the older version. The voice on the radio is speaking in the pre-1956 phonetic alphabet." Marrow already knows what he is hearing, but it is the second transmission that stops his heart. Beneath the familiar voice of the distressed pilot, layered under the static like a carrier wave, there is another sound. Not language, not noise. Structured. The same phrase, repeated at irregular intervals, in a register below ordinary human speech, in a pattern that Marrow's acoustic analysis equipment later confirms is not random. The structure is mathematical. The buried formation beneath the ocean is broadcasting, not targeting anyone, not communicating in any way that resembles intentional signalling, but broadcasting, emitting a structured pattern of electromagnetic energy that, when received by a radio tuned to the right frequency at the right moment during an activation event, sounds like something almost but not quite like language. Like a machine running a diagnostic it was designed to run forever, long after anyone who might have read the diagnostic results has ceased to exist. Marrow picks up the radio handset. He's not entirely sure what he intends to say. He presses the transmit button and says his name, his position, and the date. There is a long pause, then the radio answers, not with the distressed pilot's voice, not with the structured mathematical pattern from the formation below, with his own voice, his voice saying, "Do not map the corridor." He has never said those words before. He has never transmitted on that frequency before today. The recording he makes of the transmission is later verified by acoustic analysis to be his own voice, his precise vocal characteristics, his exact speech patterns. The transmission is him, from somewhere else, or some time else. He drops the handset. The activation begins to subside. The compass steadies. The GPS reacquires its satellites. The depth sounder shows 8,000 feet, the real depth, the correct depth. The sky returns to its ordinary blue, and somewhere on the radio, fading into static, the voice of Lieutenant Taylor continues to ask for a position fix that will never come. Marrow's vessel arrives back in Nassau 3 days after departure. To the Maritime Authority log, it has been 3 days. The fuel consumption is consistent with 3 days of operation. The food supplies are reduced by 3 days' worth. The wear on the vessel is consistent with 3 days at sea. To the crew it was 40 minutes. Not subjectively 40 minutes, actually 40 minutes. They have clear, continuous, uninterrupted memories of being at sea for 40 minutes. No one experienced the passage of 3 days. No one slept. No one ate more than a single meal. Their bodies show no sign of 3 days of sun exposure. No beard growth consistent with 3 days. No biological indication that 3 days passed. The boat travelled 3 days' worth of ocean in 40 minutes. Or the crew experienced 40 minutes while the universe outside the activation zone experienced 3 days. Marrow is careful, in his private notes, about which interpretation he favours. He is not certain they are different. The footage recorded on the crew's equipment during the expedition is partially corrupted. The 29 minutes of time that the instruments recorded and the crew did not experience are present in the footage as approximately 43 seconds of visual and audio noise. Not static, not darkness, but something resembling the visual character of film exposed to an X-ray source. Marrow spends months analysing those 43 seconds. He finds, embedded in the noise, repeating at intervals of approximately 1.618 seconds, the golden ratio again, what appears to be a structural image, the channels, the grid, B7, as if, during those 29 missing minutes, the formation was imprinting itself on every recording device in range, not sending a message, running its diagnostic, for anyone who might one day understand what the diagnostic meant. Marrow publishes nothing. He does not file a scientific paper. He does not submit his data to any institution. He does not speak to journalists, documentary makers, or other researchers. He does not contact the government agencies who, he is increasingly certain, already know what he found and have classified it into invisibility. Instead, he does one thing. He makes a private recording. In the recording, he says this: "Everyone is asking the wrong question. They want to know why things disappear in the Bermuda Triangle. That is the wrong question. The right question is why most things pass through safely. Why, if the formation beneath the Atlantic is what I believe it to be, a degrading ancient structure that generates periodic and increasingly intense activation events, why does the Atlantic remain navigable? Why are the disappearances measured in the tens and dozens rather than the hundreds and thousands? Why has the ocean not simply claimed everything that crosses it? I think the answer is that the structure is still, even in its degraded state, doing what it was originally designed to do. Whatever built Formation B7 built it to keep something closed, a rift in the seafloor, a natural discontinuity in the physical fabric of the region, something that, if left uncontrolled, would be catastrophically worse than what we see now. The transient anomalies, the disappearances, the compass failures, the time distortions are not the structure working. They are the structure failing. They are cracks in a dam, leaks in a seal. The Bermuda Triangle is not a place where the ocean opens up and takes things. It is a place where something beneath the ocean has been holding a door closed for longer than we can imagine, and the door is getting heavier, and the thing holding it is getting weaker. I do not know what is on the other side of the door. I do not want to find out. But one day, not soon maybe, not in any of our lifetimes maybe, but one day the seal will fail completely, and whatever the ancient architects of Formation B7 were keeping closed will open, and we will finally know why they built the machine in the first place. The Bermuda Triangle was never a place on a map. It was a warning label. We just mistook it for a legend. And that is the story of the Bermuda Triangle as Elias Marrow understood it. Not a cursed ocean, not a paranormal portal, not a place of ancient alien technology or divine punishment or random catastrophic tragedy. A failing machine, an ancient seal built by hands or processes we cannot identify, designed to hold closed something beneath the Atlantic that our entire civilization has never known existed. Every ship that vanished in those waters, every aircraft that fell silent mid-transmission, every compass that spun without reason, every clock that ran wrong, every crew member who vanished without a trace. They were not taken by the ocean. They were caught in a warning that no one knew how to read. The triangle on the map is not real, but the corridor beneath the waves is real. And somewhere in the deep Atlantic, 9,000 feet below the surface, buried under decades of sediment and classified documents, and the deliberate noise of a million absurd theories, Formation B7 is still running its diagnostic, still broadcasting its mathematical pattern into every era at once, still doing, in its broken and degrading way, the job it was built to do, holding the door, for now. There is a particular kind of fear that lives not in darkness or in violence, but in the ordinary and the familiar suddenly becoming strange. We accept the ocean, we map it, sail it, harvest from it, celebrate it. We write poetry about it, name our children after it, and use its image to sell perfume and holiday packages and the idea of freedom. We have decided the ocean is ours, and in that assumption, that vast, comfortable civilizational assumption, we have perhaps never seriously considered what the ocean might be doing while we are busy claiming it. The ocean is 4.5 billion years old. Human beings in roughly our current form have existed for perhaps 300,000 years. Recorded human history is approximately 5,000 years old. Oceanographic science, in any rigorous sense, is perhaps 200 years old. The deepest parts of the ocean have been visited by human beings fewer times than the surface of the moon. We know more about the geography of Mars than we know about the floor of our own ocean. And somewhere down there, in the dark, in the cold, under pressures that would destroy any vessel we have built, Formation B7 is still running, still doing its broken, imperfect, increasingly unreliable work, still generating the pulses that briefly misplace the occasional ship, still broadcasting its mathematical signature into the water above it, still holding something closed that was closed before the first human being ever looked at the horizon and wondered what was beyond it. The question Marrow asked, the one he left on his private recording, the one no institution will ever fund, the one no career-conscious scientist will ever attach their name to, is not a question about the Bermuda Triangle. It is a question about what we are living on top of, and whether whatever built the seal knew we were coming, and whether it built the seal for us, or to keep us in.